So, hello, my name's Emma Murray. I am a choreographer and performer based in Bern, Switzerland, though I'm originally from New Zealand, and I am here with Giulia Palladini. I'm very, very happy to introduce you to perhaps a New Zealand audience that might not be that familiar with what it is you do. And of course, share a conversation about what we've been doing for the last month on this digital and distanced dance residency organized from Christchurch, New Zealand. Perhaps just a little bit of context. Please feel free to just say anything if I miss anything out. But we met here in Bern in Switzerland at the University of the Arts, where you were a visiting lecturer. I took part in a workshop that you gave on archives. Archives being one of the many interesting things that you write about as a researcher and as a critical theorist. So you're currently based in London at the Roehampton University, working in the departments of theatre and dance and performance. And if there's nothing more that I maybe have missed out, I thought I would ask you about archives, as this is one of the main themes of our work together during this residency, particularly how the embodied and the digital and the archive overlap. And yeah, welcome and thank you for agreeing to do this. I was thinking we're all archivists of a nature at the moment. Well, it seems at the moment, with our ability to upload material to Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and so. And I was just wondering about this collision with the digital space and what that does to the place and the thing and the practice of archive, and perhaps yeah, reflect on that a little bit also in the work that I'm doing during this residency. But you might want to speak to this idea of an effective archive and how you think about archives in your own practice.
Yeah, my work on archives has been mostly developed alongside two lines. The first experience of archive was the practical experience of engaging with archives in my own research, in my own historiographical research. And very soon I started to question a little bit the archive as a place, or as a place of consignment, or a set of material. And I started to reflect on the notion of archive, and I would say my concept of archive is highly informed by the work of Michel Foucault. And according to Foucault, an archive is not a thing, but it's always a set of relations, and it's a system that defines what can be spoken, right? So it's actually, it's in a way the system according to which a series of statements can be pronounced, and there is a possibility of memorability. And according to Foucault, this is the way in which discourse has been elaborated historically, and this is also why archives have been historically a site of power. So I think there has been a shift of power, really, in the transformation of the archive as an institutional space, which is in a way closed and where one can enter, can have access according to very specific procedures, but also where events and things that are worth remembering are organized according to someone who has the power on memory. So I have been especially interested in undoing this logic, or in the way the notion of affect problematize or troubles, in a way, the idea of an archive as closed system. And also I've been especially interested in what kind of use can be done of archives, no? Thinking that archives are much less related to memory than to the future, that an archive in a way would be a dead thing if there was not the encounter with the present, and the possibility to mobilize the archive beyond itself. So the idea of affective archives started in my work 10 years ago, and I have done various projects that involved an active collaboration with a series of artists, precisely exploring what I think is a latent possibility in every archive, which is the activation in relation to particular affect. And when I use the word affect, I'm not talking about sentiment. I'm not talking about emotion understood as a private matter. I'm trying to think about affect as something that can possibly convoke a public feeling. And in this sense, I'm interested in archive as a praxis that reconfigures the relation between memory and history, right? Which I think is also a very gendered relation historically, right? As if history as an objective sequence of events is always male, right? And memory as a kind of reproductive work of caring for what is actually brought forward is always a more feminized idea. I mean, in a quite uneasy for me understanding of gender itself. Although I think it is worth considering how, the work of memory and the work of reproduction has been historically a work performed by women by the same token, according to the same principle, according to which women have been taking care of the house and everything that is left over, right? So just, I made the long tour to answer your question. When you asked about the possibility of the digital, there is definitely, I think, a shift in terms of power, right? So if the archive originally, etymologically relates to the origin, to the arche, and originally was located in the house of the archon, so it was the one who had the power in terms of the law on the city. The fact that potentially we can all be archivists means a democratization of the notion of archive on the one hand. Yeah. And that's great. I think that's something that we are seeing already, how it is troubling power in so many ways. I mean, if we think about all the recording with really low-tech technology that are uploaded on the internet and function as document, that then are become the spur for particular historical happening. I'm thinking about Black Lives Matters as an example.
Activation.
Yeah, it's before our eyes, right? How, that particular document, the particular video, most likely would not have been public, if there was not the possibility to immediately upload it and make it part of an archive that is broader than the one who decides. On the other hand, I do think that if we return to, to Foucault's idea of what an archive is, there is also a danger in the kind of infinite accumulation of amorphous corpus of material. So if we return to think that an archive is a system of relations, I think we may also want to think about what kind of possibilities of stories we are constructing, no?
Like a criteria, almost?
Of care, or the possibility that this, that the materials do not accumulate endlessly as a kind of a monstrous archive,
right?
But retain the possibility of a particular narrative. So I do not think that the archive is a neutral structure. I think that it's always a system in which a certain combination of elements is made possible, which I think was also the particular work that we did in my seminar, in the seminar where the two of us met. It was about trying to think about how do you organize an archive, and how do you make it intelligible? How do you allow a particular form of initiation to come out of the organization of this collection, no?
Yeah, exactly. If I remember correctly, people were quite creative with their responses to that idea. And we had someone propose a mind map of their anxiety, or a map of their anxiety, I think. And there were different examples of the way that people were choosing to address that. Yeah.
Yeah, because one of the questions we were facing then was, how do you archive what is ephemeral, what actually
what is unarchivable? Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Which I guess brings us back to the question of archive and performance. That is perhaps one of the topics that
yes, of course. And this idea of how to archive, well, how embodied practices kind of interact with the archive, how things like dancing, singing, movement, how do you see their place within the archive?
Well, you know, there is a debate in performance studies that has been going on for at least a couple of decades now, because I think there was this very influential text in the 90s called The Ontology of Performance by Peggy Phelan, who's an American researcher, who has famously declared performance as what becomes itself through its disappearance. And so putting an emphasis really on the ephemerality of performance and on the ontological quality of performance as what leaves no trace. I myself find myself disagreeing with this statement, or at least uneasy, because I think in a way this conception of performance as something that disappears in a way forgets or disavow or the work of the audience, right? Or actually the role of witness, the particular consumption, the labor of receiving performance, and also in another way everything that leads to the event. So in my thinking, actually the event never really exists as itself, but is always part of a continuity. And so I am much more interested to think about how the relation between the ephemeral traces of performance and what is left over continue to operate in the public sphere. Of course, Peggy Phelan has not been the only position. There has been really rich debate about archives. I'm thinking about Diana Taylor's work. She has, for example, proposed the notion of repertoire as, let's say, countering the idea of archive as mainly text-based, and trying to think about everything that is passed on through the body, and that actually belongs to precisely embodied practices, have to do, you know, also with tradition and with other forms of memory that have to do precisely that in a way develop alongside the written word, or actually have a conception of memory that is not necessarily bound to the document, yeah. And so I think, from my point of view, the idea of affective archives tries is more interested in the use and the praxis of the archive than in the document itself, yeah, in the nature of the document itself. And at the same time, I'm also much less interested in the authenticity of the document, whether the document is actually original or if it's a fiction, than in what kind of operational capacity in terms of critical or poetic drive can the document produce. And that's why I've been particularly interested in artistic production that thought of itself in a way as a living archive. In the last years, I've been working a lot with the Colombian theater group called Mapa Teatro. And they, for example, for me, are an outstanding example of the potentiality of performance to turn itself into an archive, and into an archive of, because of performance intrinsic technology and knowledge of the body, and capacity to actually turn itself as invent modality of documentation of something that supposedly cannot be documented because it's characterized by its appearance.
Yeah, wow. That might lead us to my next question. I mean, if we talk about disappearance and something that cannot be completed or that never arrives, and your concept of foreplay within performance practice. And I wonder if you might share that with us, because I know it's been a big concentration of your work till now.
Yeah. So the concept of foreplay has been, let's say, developing alongside my work or in my work over the last 10 years at this point. So in a way it has had various declensions and form, and was born as a desire on my part to find a way to account for the way artistic work and the work of preparation, or what is posited as preparation for a project, is, or the status or the ontological status of this work vis-a-vis the final event, right? In a condition which I myself find myself working in, which is a condition of projective temporality, right? So conditions in which, in a way, most of the activities that supposedly lead to an outcome are considered preparation or do not exist separately from this. And I guess this is the condition that is very well inscribed in the way contemporary neoliberal capitalism work according to the logic of the project. So I'm not the first one to actually signal the particular temporality that characterizes the way we work in this context. Now, the idea of foreplay is of course borrowed by sexual terminology. And this is so because I started to ask myself how to find what other activities do we have as examples of activities that are supposedly inscribed in a projective temporality, but actually in their own nature, they reveal the intrinsic fiction of what the projective temporality is, right? And I thought, as I thought in particular about how, you know, in terms of the gestures and the relation between pleasure and desire in sexuality, which is always described as a progressive growth towards a climax, is actually quite at odds with the embodied experience of pleasure, and especially with the structure of the female orgasm that is in fact multiple. So I started to explore foreplay as a possible model to try to think about a different engagement with the temporality of artistic production that is not necessarily captured by its necessity to become value in a market. Right. So yeah, I must say that there is an ambiguity that is intrinsic to the concept of foreplay that I'm fully aware of. Because actually it is, in a sense, a tactical reclaiming of pleasure in a structure that is given as potential exploitation, because of course we know that pleasure is used most likely as the main engine of exploitation and self-exploitation. So, so the concept of foreplay has been, in a way, for me, the way to think about the erotics of artistic production, while at the same time trying to understand the mechanism of incorporation that this pleasure is undergoing.
Right. So maybe just to understand a little bit what you were mentioning there about exploitation, this could be a way, if we speak about artists taking pleasure in their work, where they might be the work might be undervalued, they might not be paid, for example. Is that what you mean by exploitation? Yeah.
I'm especially thinking about the blurring boundaries between work time and free time that, of course, you know very well are what both the art market but also knowledge production in general tried, no?
Yes.
The idea that we are working all the time and that we love our work is a long-standing cliche that very often leads to condition of inequality and also, I mean, is a sort of for me it's also a sort of a cliche that reiterates a particular privileged position of artists, right? Whereas I think you know the relation between pleasure and work interests me precisely because you know, in the world that I would like to inhabit, work and pleasure should not be against each other, actually, which I think bring us back to some of our conversation about the work of Audre, for example, no? The idea of the uses of the erotics and the idea that the erotics as a force that is within our life can possibly be what remind us of what we should be doing all the time. So actually, I'm really interested in pleasure as an embodied experience of desire, whereas desire is actually always thought as based on the idea of a lack. And the biggest desiring machine, if I remember well, a quote from Deleuze, capitalism is the biggest desiring machine, right? So it's a machine that constantly, in a way, delays the possibility of pleasure.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I remember also a conversation we had where I gave the example of a residency, perhaps, like the very one that we're on, working this month, as an example of perhaps this you know, idea of foreplay. And you disagreed, which I think plays into this idea of the capitalist model of work that also applies to artistic production.
Yeah, I mean, I do not necessarily disagree. I do think that the residence, as much as the application, are very often the units in which artistic labor and knowledge production are organized by institutions in order to organize production, and that's okay, I think. And I do not think that unproductivity is a solution to that. But I do think that it's very important to try to think about what kind of temporality is being developed in the work itself, right? And according to what kind of stages of crystals of production the work can emerge. What are the, in a way, the waves of emergency of the work? So in a sense, when we're discussing what does it mean to go back to an archive, right? When we're discussing your work, I think this also means how do we deal with the ever-returning nature of the same ideas and the same obsessions, whereas we are constantly demanded to produce the new. Yeah. To call back into the conversation again, Audre, there is one of my favorite quotes from Audre is, there are no new ideas, there are only new ways of making them feel. And then she lists so many moments when, you know, actually you are thinking the same idea, but in a very different moment of the day, and how this particular moment of the day affects that idea and shapes it in a different form, which I think is in a way what we always do, that there is an intrinsic continuity of poiein, right, of poiesis, that is like the root of poetry, which is a making, which is a doing that is not necessarily leading to a product, okay? But of course, the structure of the application or the structure of the residency as a premise needs the idea of an outcome. And so I would say rather than a solution, foreplay is more of a diagnosis of the situation, and then an attempt to think how to navigate within the diagnosis and how actually to, to reconfigure or to understand what are the temporal forms that are more specific to our doing.
I don't know if this is relevant, but it reminds me slightly of a work I made called This Is the Beginning in 2016. And a sort of tactic that I used was to think of it as a work in progress. And I referred to it as that for the time of making it and also afterwards. And it seemed to kind of delay any anxiety I had about the outcome and kind of be able to enjoy its becoming, as almost as a tactic of avoiding the anxiety of outcome.
Yeah, and I think it is interesting that you use the word anxiety, because I think, you know, the social and political conditions of work and production are not only economic matters, but they actually get under our skin.
Yes, absolutely.
Actually, you know, work on the very subjectivity that produces the work. And so I think that's one of the problems that we are facing, that a lot of projects think of themselves as projects, yeah? And think of them, so in a way, it is the structure of the financial capital where there is an investment and then you will have a revenue later on, yeah? Which is also the idea of the foreplay as something that is only supplementary to the orgasm. Whereas obviously, you know, what I tried to understand is what happens in all the moments that leads to the orgasm, and how can you actually even think about pleasure beyond the orgasm. You know, what makes an event the marker of a particular value in terms of production. That's more or less the terrain I've been exploring with this concept.
Yeah. I'm wondering how an artist's desire for success or having their work being seen as successful, how that fits into those modes of working.
I must say I am not that interested in success. I don't really get the notion. Probably, I mean, because for me, success is always a marker of value. And I think my entire thinking is more or less an attempt to resist or to trouble the idea of value, mainly because you know, the validation of a particular work as successful, and success as a stage that is reached is necessarily what determines a particular human practice as successful work. So in a way, it is regulating human practice in a way that does not really interest me. In fact, I don't think that artistic production interests me at all in terms of aesthetics. I think artistic production does interest me as a technology of transformation of life force or forces, or ways in which particular forms of life are elaborated, are made visible, are transformed, are imagined, are conjured. And in that sense, this is what the work is. In that sense, this particular success is not measurable. Yeah. So I must say I'm a bit at odds with the notion of success.
Maybe one of my last questions might be then about your work as a critical theorist, and that seems to follow on quite nicely to what you just said, and how it meets performance practices. And I did read somewhere in an interview that you said theory is not, they are not recipes for contemporary art practice. And I'm just wondering if we could talk a little bit about how those two things meet, and sometimes the tools are a little misused, and there's these hierarchies that exist between the two, and yeah, that uneasy kind of surrogacy that the theory, your field, and contemporary art practice are kind of.
Yeah. Mm, I mean, I have found a really fruitful the word and productive and generative to be in dialogue with artists and practitioners over the last 10 years. And I do think that we are actually asking the same questions, and we should be asking the same questions with different techniques. In that sense, not only I do welcome, but I think is incredibly helpful, would be incredibly helpful to explore ever new ways in which artistic practice and critical theory are in dialogue with each other in terms of articulating questions, because actually I think none of the two fields are providing any answer or solution. But I think if there is a quality, is the critical and poetic capacity that both these fields can have. So in that sense, I do think that critical theory as a poetic force in itself, yeah? And there is definitely a problem when there is something that is parachuted onto a work for a reason, and that, it's applied to a work. Yes, the very idea of applying the concept to the work is something I myself find always a bit uncomfortable with. Having said that, I also think, once ideas are out there in the world, they are up for grabs. And so I myself am always conscious that the idea of foreplay, for example, is out there in the world, and you don't really know what kind of uses people may want to make of it. And I cannot bring it back to my body and to my mind. Yeah, it's like, we talked about motherhood, a topic about, that I am particularly ignorant about. So I can imagine what being a mother might be for a concept. And using this metaphor is like, once the child is out there in the world, there is no way, you need to have it run. And so in that sense, I'm just thinking, one of the things I find really important and interesting was something I read that Brecht wrote, and it's that actually ideas are always, how was it? Ideas are always by humans for humans. And so for every ideas, you have to look for the specific people they are addressed to. And I think this is something really worth thinking, that they're not, we are never really producing in a void. We are always producing in a dialogue. I'm talking to you right now, and this conversation would be very, very different with any other person. And
yes.
Surely, the same would be for you when you're thinking about the particular context in which your work will be received. There is always a relation. We are always in relation, which I think in this particular historical circumstances is something that we are thinking about a lot. Probably the most problematic, painful, and hopeful side of the pandemics is our being related.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yes. Wow. I could listen to you all day, but I know that we don't have all day. So we should wrap this up. I wanted to just thank you again, Giulia, for your time and for this wonderful opportunity to work alongside you, even from our respective locations in the world. And this meeting, this relation between practice and theory, it's proved super fruitful, and your articulation, your generosity, and your ideas meeting with my attempts of producing some work here in the studio have been, yeah, I've appreciated it so much. So thank you.
Thank you, Emma. It's been a pleasure talking to you and working together as we will continue working together. I do think you're asking yourself real questions about, you know, I think one of the questions that this is a little bit of a preview about your work, probably for those who will then look at the outcome of the residency is really these questions about the inside and outside of your archive and you know, whatever is actually memory or and whatever is a memory of the future or some, you know, some particular ways in which you are already beyond this archive and you're returning to it, or you're creating a memory that you will return to into the future. So I really think, you know, I really welcome the joy of this process of unpacking and repacking your archive. And it's been really, you know, a pleasure to wander around it with you. So thank you very much, and hopefully next conversation will be in person.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah. Take care and all the best. Thank you. Bye-bye.